The morning fog hung thick over Heathrow Airport as Captain James Mitchell adjusted his red ceremonial tunic for what he thought would be the last time. At 62 years old, his weathered hands trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons that had caught the light during countless royal ceremonies. The Victoria Cross pinned to his chest felt heavier than usual, its bronze weight carrying 40 years of military service and a moment of extraordinary courage in Afghanistan that had nearly cost him his life. James had been working for British Airways for 3 years since retiring from the Queen's Guard. The airline had been proud to employ a decorated war hero, often featuring him in their promotional materials. His colleagues respected him, passengers frequently thanked him for his service, and management had initially praised his dedication. But today felt different. The atmosphere in the crew briefing room was tense, and several colleagues avoided making eye contact with him. Sarah Henderson, the new station manager, was barely 30 years old and had joined the company 6 months ago from a budget airline. She had made it clear from her first day that she intended to modernize operations and cut costs wherever possible. Her business degree from a prestigious university had earned her rapid promotions, but many veteran employees questioned whether she understood the aviation industry's traditions and values. During the morning briefing, Sarah's voice cut through the usual chatter like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to discuss uniform compliance and company image standards." Her eyes swept across the room before settling on James. "Some of you seem to think that personal decorations and military insignia belong on our company. Uniforms? This is not the armed forces, this is a commercial airline." The room fell silent. Every crew member knew she was talking about James and his Victoria Cross. For 3 years, the airline had celebrated his service, featuring photos of him in uniform with his medal prominently displayed in company newsletters and marketing materials. Passengers often approached him with gratitude, and many had specifically requested flights where he was working. James felt his stomach tighten. He had worn his medal with pride, not as a show of arrogance, but as a reminder of the men who hadn't come home. The Victoria Cross represented more than his own actions. It honored his fallen comrades and the values they had died defending. The Bronze Cross had been struck from metal taken from Russian cannons captured in the Crimean War, connecting him to generations of British servicemen who had shown extraordinary valor. "Captain Mitchell," Sarah continued, her voice crisp and businesslike, "while we appreciate your military service, British Airways has specific uniform standards. Personal decorations and military medals are not part of our dress code. Effective immediately, you will remove all non-company insignia from your uniform." The words hit James like a physical blow. Around him, he could see the shock on his colleagues' faces. Emma Watson, a flight attendant who had worked with him for 2 years, looked horrified. Captain David Roberts, a former RAF pilot, shook his head in disbelief. Even the younger crew members who hadn't served in the military seemed stunned by the coldness of the directive. "Ma'am," James said carefully, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him, "this medal was awarded by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for actions in service of our country. It represents the highest honor for military valor in the British and Commonwealth forces. I've worn it with pride for 20 years, including during my time here, with the full knowledge and approval of previous management." Sarah's expression remained unmoved. "I understand the significance, Captain Mitchell, but company policy is company policy. We cannot make exceptions. Our uniform standards exist to maintain a professional, cohesive appearance. Personal decorations, regardless of their importance, create inconsistencies in our brand image." The room was so quiet that the sound of aircraft engines outside seemed deafening. James could feel the weight of decades crashing down on him. He thought about the day he had earned the Victoria Cross, crawling through enemy fire to rescue 3 wounded soldiers while his own unit was pinned down. He remembered the pride in his father's eyes when Queen Elizabeth II had placed the medal around his neck at Buckingham Palace. He recalled his late wife Mary telling him how handsome he looked in his uniform, medal gleaming on his chest. "You have two options," Sarah continued, consulting her tablet. "Comply with the uniform policy and remove the medal, or we'll have to consider this insubordination. I'm sure you understand the consequences of that." James straightened his shoulders, drawing on the military bearing that had never left him despite his years in civilian service. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be suspended pending a disciplinary hearing, which could result in termination." Sarah's tone suggested she was already preparing the paperwork. "I'm sorry, but rules are rules. We cannot run an airline based on sentimentality." The word sentimentality struck James like a slap. His sacrifice, the blood of his comrades, the highest honor his country could bestow, reduced to mere sentiment by someone who had never worn a uniform or answered her country's call. He looked around the room at his colleagues, seeing a mixture of anger, sadness, and helplessness in their faces. Emma Watson finally found her voice. "Sarah, with respect, Captain Mitchell's medal is part of who he is. Passengers love seeing it. It makes them proud to fly with us." "That's exactly the problem," Sarah replied sharply. "We're not running a military museum, we're operating a commercial airline. Our brand identity should come from our service quality and efficiency, not from individual employees' personal histories." James felt something inside him break. Not his resolve, but his faith in the institution he had served so faithfully. He slowly reached up and unpinned the Victoria Cross from his tunic. The medal felt cold in his palm as he looked at it one final time before slipping it into his pocket. "There," he said quietly. "Is that better, Miss Henderson?" Sarah nodded briskly, already moving on to other business matters. But James was no longer listening. As she droned on about punctuality metrics and customer satisfaction scores, he found himself thinking about his old unit, about the friends who had died believing they were protecting something worthwhile. He wondered what they would think of this moment, of their sacrifice being deemed unprofessional by someone who had never risked anything more dangerous than a PowerPoint presentation. The meeting ended, and James walked slowly toward his gate. Assignment? His uniform feeling strangely empty without the familiar weight of his medal. Word of the incident spread through Heathrow Airport like wildfire. By lunchtime, ground crew members were whispering about it in the cargo holds, and gate agents were discussing it between passenger announcements. The story reached the ears of veteran employees who remembered when airlines took pride in hiring military heroes, when service members were celebrated rather than silenced. James went about his duties mechanically, checking passenger manifests and coordinating with air traffic control, but his heart wasn't in it. Every time he caught his reflection in the aircraft's polished surfaces, he was reminded of the empty space on his uniform where his medal should have been. Passengers who recognized him from previous flights asked where his shiny medal had gone, and he struggled to find diplomatic answers. Margaret Thompson, a regular business traveler who flew the London-Edinburgh route twice weekly, was among the first to notice. She had always made a point of thanking James for his service, and her grandfather had served in World War II. When she saw him without his Victoria Cross, she was visibly upset. "Captain Mitchell, where's your medal?" she asked during boarding. James forced a smile. "Company policy changes, I'm afraid." Margaret's face darkened. "What kind of policy removes a Victoria Cross? That's not just any decoration. That's the highest honor our country can give." As the day wore on, more passengers began asking similar questions. A retired colonel traveling to Scotland demanded to speak with management. An elderly woman whose husband had died in the Falklands War started crying when she learned what had happened. Even younger passengers who might not have understood the medal's significance could sense that something important had been taken away. The crew members were equally disturbed. Captain Roberts found James during a break and shook his head grimly. 25 years I've been flying, and I've never seen anything like this." They're treating your Victoria Cross like it's some kind of fashion accessory. Emma Watson was more direct. It's disgraceful, James. Absolutely disgraceful. My own grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew how they're treating our veterans. By evening, social media had picked up the story. A passenger had discreetly photographed James with and without his medal, posting the images with a caption that read, "British Airways removes Victoria Cross from war heroes' uniform. Is this the respect our veterans deserve?" The post began, circulating rapidly among military communities and veterans organizations. Sarah Henderson remained unmoved by the growing criticism. When approached by several senior staff members who urged her to reconsider, she stood firm. "I understand this is emotional for some people, but we cannot run a business based on emotions. Standards exist for a reason, and they must be applied consistently." Her supervisor, regional manager Peter Collins, called her that evening after social media posts about the incident began appearing on his newsfeed. "Sarah, I'm hearing some concerning things about Captain Mitchell and his medal. Can you walk me through what happened?" "I enforced our uniform policy," she replied confidently. "Personal decorations aren't permitted, regardless of their significance. It's clearly stated in our employee handbook." Peter, a 20-year veteran of the airline industry, felt a sinking sensation. "Sarah, do you understand what a Victoria Cross represents? It's not a personal decoration. It's the highest military honor for valor. Only a handful of people alive today wear that medal." "I understand its historical significance," Sarah replied, her tone suggesting she felt her authority was being questioned. "But our uniform policy doesn't make exceptions. If we allow one person to wear unauthorized items, where does it end?" Peter rubbed his temples, sensing a public relations disaster brewing. "Have you seen the social media reaction?" "Social media outrage doesn't dictate company policy," Sarah said firmly. "Our job is to run a professional operation, not to cater to every sentiment." Meanwhile, James had gone home to his small flat in Hounslow, the Victoria Cross sitting on his kitchen table like an accusation. His wife Mary had passed away 5 years earlier, and his daughter lived in Australia with her family. The flat felt particularly empty that night, filled only with memories and the ticking of an old clock that had belonged to his father. He picked up the medal, feeling its familiar weight. The bronze was worn smooth in places where he had touched it over the years, and the crimson ribbon was slightly faded from decades of wear. He thought about the morning in Afghanistan when everything had changed, when 3 of his men had been pinned down by sniper fire and he had made the decision that would earn him Britain's highest honor. The Taliban fighters had been positioned in a compound about 200 meters away, their shots keeping his patrol trapped behind a low wall. Private Jenkins was bleeding badly from a leg wound, and Corporal Williams had taken shrapnel in his shoulder. The third man, young Private Davies, was only 19 and crying for his mother. James had looked at his options and realized there weren't any good ones. The enemy position was too well fortified for a frontal assault, and air support was 20 minutes away, too long for Jenkins, who was losing blood fast. So he had done the only thing he could. He had crawled across 200 meters of open ground under enemy fire, reached his men, and single-handedly fought off the attackers while dragging each of them to safety. The citation had used words like extraordinary courage and complete disregard for personal safety. But James had never seen it that way. He had simply done what needed to be done, what any good soldier would do for his mates. The medal wasn't really his. It belonged to everyone who served, everyone who put their life on the line for their brothers in arms. Now, sitting alone in his kitchen, he wondered if he had been naive to think civilian society would understand that. Perhaps Sarah Henderson was right. Perhaps in the modern world, such things were just sentiment, outdated relics of a time when honor and sacrifice meant something different. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "James, check the British Airways Facebook page. People are furious." He didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of him. The airline's latest post about a new route launch had been overwhelmed by comments about his treatment. Hundreds of people were expressing outrage, sharing their own military stories, and calling for boycotts. Veterans organizations were beginning to take notice, and several had already posted statements condemning the airline's actions. As James scrolled through the comments, he saw story after story from fellow veterans, from military families, from ordinary citizens who understood what his medal represented. Their support warmed him, but it also made him sadder. These people got it. They understood that some things were bigger than corporate policies and brand consistency. He placed the Victoria Cross back on the table and stared at it in the lamplight. Tomorrow, he would have to face another day of work without it. Another day of explaining to confused passengers why a national hero had been stripped of his honor for the sake of uniform compliance. The next morning brought chaos that Sarah Henderson had not anticipated. The British Airways customer service lines were jammed with calls from angry passengers threatening to cancel bookings. The company's social media accounts were under siege. From military veterans, their families and supporters who viewed the treatment of Captain Mitchell as a national disgrace. Major newspapers had picked up the story overnight. The Daily Telegraph ran a front-page headline reading, "Airways strips Hero of Honor," while the Times featured an editorial questioning whether British institutions still valued military service. Even international outlets were covering the story, with CNN and the BBC World Service discussing the controversy. Sarah arrived at work to find her email inbox overflowing with messages from senior executives, public relations specialists, and legal advisors. The airline's stock price had already dropped 2% in early trading, and several corporate clients were reconsidering their travel contracts. The backlash was far beyond anything she had imagined when she enforced what she considered a simple uniform policy. Regional Manager Peter Collins called an emergency meeting for 8 in the morning. Around the conference table sat senior managers, legal representatives, and public relations experts who had been hastily assembled to address the growing crisis. Sarah sat uncomfortably as she realized she was the only person in the room who still believed her actions had been correct. "Explain to me," Peter began, his voice tight with controlled anger, "how enforcing a uniform policy has turned into a public relations nightmare that's costing us millions in market value." Sarah straightened in her chair. "The media has blown this out of proportion. We cannot run an airline by making exceptions for individual employees, regardless of their personal achievements. If we compromise our standards for one person, we compromise them for everyone." The head of public relations, Diana Walsh, looked at Sarah as if she had lost her mind. "Do you understand what you've done? You've taken away a Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the Commonwealth, from a man who risked his life for his country. The optics are catastrophic." "Optics don't run airlines," Sarah replied. "Consistent policies and professional standards do. And customers don't fly airlines that disrespect war heroes," Diana shot back. "We've had over 10,000 negative comments in the past 12 hours. Veterans organizations are calling for boycotts. Military families are switching to other carriers. This is a disaster." Legal advisor Robert Hayes leaned forward. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly. Did you research Captain Mitchell's background before taking this action? Did you understand the significance of what you were asking him to remove?" Sarah felt the first flutter of uncertainty. "I knew it was a military medal, but our policy clearly states that personal decorations are not permitted on company uniforms." "Personal decorations?" Robert's voice rose. "The Victoria Cross isn't a personal decoration. It's a national honor awarded by the sovereign. There are fewer than 15 living recipients. You might as well have asked him to remove a knighthood." Peter Collins rubbed his forehead, feeling a massive headache building. "How many people knew about this policy change before you implemented it?" "I didn't need approval for enforcing existing policy," Sarah said, though her confidence was beginning to waver. Except this isn't existing policy, Diana interjected, pulling out a folder thick with documents. I've been through our uniform guidelines going back 20 years. Military decorations have always been permitted, especially significant ones like the Victoria Cross. In fact, we've used Captain Mitchell in our marketing materials specifically because of his medal. The room fell silent as the magnitude of Sarah's error became clear. She had not only misinterpreted company policy, but had created a crisis based on her personal misunderstanding of military traditions and corporate guidelines. Meanwhile, James was going through his morning routine at the airport, unaware that his situation had become a national talking point. Colleagues approached him throughout the morning with words of support and updates on the growing media attention. He felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of public support, but also embarrassed by the attention. Captain Roberts found him in the crew lounge and sat down beside him. "James, mate, you need to see this." He showed him a tablet displaying news coverage from around the world. "The whole country is talking about what happened to you." James stared at the screen in disbelief. "I never wanted this kind of attention. I just wanted to do my job and wear my medal with pride." "That's exactly why people are so angry," Roberts replied. "You're not seeking publicity or special treatment. You're a decorated veteran who was humiliated by someone who doesn't understand what service means." Emma Watson joined them, her face flushed with excitement. "James, you're not going to believe this. I just heard from management. There's going to be an emergency meeting this afternoon, and apparently some very important people are asking questions about your situation." As the morning progressed, the story continued to gain momentum. Military historians were giving interviews about the significance of the Victoria Cross. Veterans were sharing their own stories of discrimination. Politicians were making statements about the importance of honoring military service. The incident had touched a nerve that went far beyond airline uniform policies. Sarah Henderson found herself increasingly isolated as the day went on. Colleagues who had once respected her efficiency and modern approach were now questioning her judgment. Several senior crew members had requested transfers to other supervisors. Even the junior staff were treating her with barely concealed contempt. The breaking point came when Peter Collins received a phone call that changed everything. The caller's identity was not disclosed, but the message was clear and urgent. Very important people were taking notice of Captain Mitchell's situation, and they were not pleased with how a decorated veteran was being treated. "Sarah," Peter said when he found her in her office, "we need to talk immediately. This situation has escalated beyond anything we imagined." She looked up from her computer where she had been trying to focus on routine administrative tasks while ignoring the chaos swirling around her. "If this is about the media coverage, I maintain that we made the correct decision based on company policy." "Company policy that apparently doesn't exist," Peter replied grimly. "And that's the least of our problems now. I just received a call that suggests this situation is about to get much more complicated." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of call?" Peter sat down across from her desk, his expression grave. "The kind that makes me very concerned about both your future with this company and the damage you've done to our reputation. We need to fix this, Sarah, and we need to fix it today." Outside her office window, Sarah could see ground crew members gathered in small groups, their conversations animated and their expressions serious. The entire airport seemed to be buzzing with talk about Captain Mitchell and his Victoria Cross. What she had thought would be a simple enforcement of uniform standards had become something much larger and more dangerous. For the first time since the incident began, Sarah Henderson realized she might have made a catastrophic mistake. The atmosphere at Heathrow Airport was electric with tension and anticipation. Word had spread through the terminals that something unprecedented was about to happen. Security personnel were conducting additional sweeps, and airport management was in constant communication with external authorities. The media presence had grown throughout the morning, with news vans lining the perimeter roads and reporters trying to gain access to the terminals. James Mitchell remained unaware of the full scope of what was unfolding around him. He was focused On his duties, preparing for what he expected would be a routine afternoon flight to Edinburgh. The past 2 days had been emotionally exhausting, and he found solace in the familiar rhythms of pre-flight checks and passenger coordination. In the emergency boardroom meeting, Sarah Henderson was facing the most intense scrutiny of her career. Diana Walsh had compiled a devastating presentation showing the financial and reputational damage caused by the Victoria Cross incident. Stock prices had continued to fall, major corporate clients were suspending contracts, and competitor airlines were already running advertisements highlighting their respect for military veterans. "The situation has moved beyond our control," Diana announced to the assembled executives. "This is no longer about uniform policy or internal management decisions. Captain Mitchell has become a symbol, and we're on the wrong side of public opinion." Peter. Collins received another phone call during the meeting, and his expression grew increasingly grave as he listened. When he hung up, the room fell silent, waiting for him to speak. "That was Buckingham Palace," he said quietly. "They're very concerned about how a Victoria Cross recipient is being treated by a British company. They've made it clear that this situation reflects poorly on our nation's commitment to honoring military service." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She had never imagined that her enforcement of uniform policy would attract royal attention. The Victoria Cross was, after all, awarded by the sovereign, making any disrespect toward it a matter of particular sensitivity to the royal household. "What exactly did they say?" asked Robert Hayes, the legal advisor. Peter consulted his notes carefully. They expressed disappointment that a recipient of Her Late Majesty's highest honor for military valor was being subjected to what they termed inappropriate treatment. They also indicated that other parties are taking interest in ensuring this matter is resolved satisfactorily. The implications hung in the air like a threat. When Buckingham Palace expressed concern about something, it rarely remained a private matter for long. The royal family's support for military veterans was well known, and their disapproval could destroy careers and reputations. Meanwhile, James was conducting his pre-flight inspection when Captain Roberts approached him with an unusual request. "James, I need you to stay flexible with your schedule today. There might be some changes to your assignment." "What kind of changes?" James asked, though he had learned not to expect straightforward answers anymore. "The kind I can't explain, right?" "Now," Roberts replied. "Just trust me on this one." Across the airport, security teams were implementing protocols that most employees had never seen before. Additional personnel were being positioned at strategic locations, and several gates were being cleared of non-essential staff. The official explanation was routine security procedures, but experienced airport workers recognized the signs of preparation for a very important visitor. Sarah Henderson was summoned to another meeting, this time with the airline's chief executive officer, who had flown in from London specifically to address the crisis. CEO Margaret Stevens was known throughout the industry as a tough, no-nonsense leader who had transformed struggling airlines into profitable enterprises. She was also a strong supporter of military veterans, having served briefly in the Royal Navy before entering corporate life. "Ms. Henderson," Stevens began without preamble, "explain to me how a simple uniform policy has become a national incident involving Buckingham Palace, the Ministry of Defense, and half the British press." Sarah tried to maintain her composure, but the weight of accumulated pressure was beginning to show. "I was enforcing company standards that I believed were clearly established. I had no intention of creating controversy. Intentions are irrelevant now," Stevens replied coldly. "Results are what matter, and the results of your actions are catastrophic. We're facing boycotts, stock devaluation, and governmental scrutiny. More importantly, we've humiliated a man who risked his life for our country." "I understand the situation has escalated beyond expectations," Sarah admitted, "but changing our decision now might appear weak and inconsistent." Stevens stared at her for a long moment. "Weak and inconsistent? Do you know what appears weak? A company that doesn't have the courage to admit when it's wrong. Do you know what appears inconsistent? disrespecting our veterans while claiming to represent British values." The meeting was interrupted by Stevens's assistant, who entered with an urgent message. After reading it, Stevens looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed amazement and fury. "It appears," Stevens said slowly, "that we're about to receive a visit from someone who takes a very personal interest in how Victoria Cross recipients are treated. I suggest you prepare yourself for a conversation that will likely determine whether you have a future with this company." At that moment, James was taking a break in the crew lounge when Emma Watson burst in, her face flushed with excitement and disbelief. "James," she said breathlessly, "you need to come with me right now. Something incredible is happening." "What are you talking about?" James asked, though he could see from her expression that something significant was unfolding. "I can't explain it properly," Emma replied, "but there are people here who want to meet you. Important people. Very important people." As they walked through the terminal, James noticed the increased security presence and the unusual activity around them. Airport staff were positioning themselves along the corridors, and several gates had been cleared of passengers. The atmosphere felt charged with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something momentous to occur. "Emma," James said as they approached a restricted area he had never entered before, "what exactly is going on here?" Before she could answer, a security officer in an expensive suit approached them. "Captain Mitchell, would you please come with—" "Me, sir. There's someone who would very much like to meet you." James felt his heart racing as he followed the security officer through corridors that seemed to lead deeper into the airport's administrative areas. Behind them, Emma was being escorted by another official, her expression mixing excitement with nervous anticipation. The Victoria Cross in James's pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, and he began to understand that the next few minutes would likely change everything. Whatever was about to happen would either vindicate his decades of service or confirm his worst fears about how modern society viewed its veterans. As they approached a door marked with official seals and additional security personnel, James realized that his quiet life as a retired soldier had just taken a turn he could never have imagined. The private conference room had been hastily prepared for an arrival that had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of British Airways management. James Mitchell stood uncertainly near the entrance, still wearing his airline uniform with the conspicuous absence of his Victoria Cross. The security detail around him was unlike anything he had seen in civilian life, reminding him of the protection protocols he had witnessed during his years guarding royal residences. Airport officials moved with nervous efficiency, ensuring everything was perfect for a visitor whose identity had been revealed to only the most senior personnel. James could hear whispered conversations and the crackling of radio communications, but no one had yet explained why he had been brought to this secure area. Emma Watson stood beside him, equally confused but visibly excited. "James," she whispered, "look at all this security. Whoever's coming must be incredibly important." Before James could respond, the room's atmosphere changed dramatically. The casual chatter stopped. Security personnel straightened to attention, and everyone's focus shifted toward the entrance. James felt a familiar sensation from his military days, the electric tension that preceded the arrival of someone of extraordinary rank and importance. The door opened and James's world tilted on its axis. King Charles III entered the room with the measured dignity that had defined his decades of public service. Despite being in his 70s, he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. His presence filled the space immediately, and James felt his military training take over as he instinctively stood at attention. "Your Majesty," James said, executing a perfect military bow that felt as natural as breathing despite his years in civilian service. "Captain Mitchell," the king replied, his voice carrying both warmth and authority. "I've heard about the treatment you've received, and I felt it was important to address this matter personally." James struggled to find words. In all his years of royal guard duty, he had interacted with members of the royal family professionally, but never imagined having a personal audience with the monarch. The surreal nature of the moment, being in an airport conference room with the King of England because someone had taken away his medal, was almost overwhelming. "I understand," King Charles continued, "that you've been asked to remove your Victoria Cross while performing your duties with this airline. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Majesty," James replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I was told it violated uniform policy." The king's expression hardened slightly. "The Victoria Cross is not merely a military decoration, Captain Mitchell. It represents the highest honor our nation can bestow for extraordinary valor. It was awarded to you by my mother, Queen Elizabeth II, for actions that saved the lives of your fellow soldiers. It is not something that can be simply removed or hidden to satisfy corporate policies." Emma Watson, who had been standing quietly nearby, felt tears welling up in her eyes as she witnessed this unprecedented show of royal support for an ordinary working man who had been treated unfairly. "Your Majesty," James said carefully, "I've tried to serve with honor both in the military and in civilian life. I never sought attention or special treatment. I just wanted to wear my medal with the pride it deserves." "And you should wear it with pride," King Charles replied firmly. "Every day of your life. The men you saved in Afghanistan, the example you set for others, the values you represent. These things matter more than any corporate manual or uniform policy." At that moment, Sarah Henderson was being escorted into the room by security personnel who had made it clear that her presence was required immediately. She entered to find herself face to face with King Charles III, and the magnitude of her error hit her like a physical blow. The King of England had personally intervened because of her decision to remove a war hero's medal. "You must be Ms. Henderson," the king said, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been when addressing James. "I believe you're the person responsible for this situation." Sarah felt her knees weaken. She had imagined many possible consequences for her actions, but standing before the monarch and being held personally accountable had never entered her mind. "Your Majesty, I was simply enforcing company policy as I understood it." "Company policy?" King Charles's voice carried a sharp edge. "Do you understand what you've done? You've humiliated a man who risked his life for his country, who carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, who represents the finest traditions of British military service. You've treated his Victoria Cross, awarded by my mother, as if it were some trivial accessory." The room was absolutely silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of airport operations. Everyone present understood. They were witnessing something extraordinary. A monarch personally defending a veteran's honor against corporate indifference. "I want you to understand something very clearly, Ms. Henderson," King Charles continued. "The Victoria Cross is not subject to company policies. It is a sacred trust between our nation and those who serve it with extraordinary courage. Captain Mitchell earned the right to wear that medal through actions that most people could never imagine attempting." Sarah tried to speak, but the king continued before she could find words. "I have spoken with your senior management, and they have assured me that this situation will be corrected immediately and permanently. Captain Mitchell will wear his Victoria Cross with the respect and honor it deserves, and there will be no further interference with his right to do so." James felt emotions welling up that he had suppressed for days. The validation from the highest authority in the land meant more than he could express. His service, his sacrifice, his fallen comrades, all of it was being acknowledged and honored by the sovereign himself. "Furthermore," King Charles added, "I want it understood that any organization or individual who seeks to diminish the honors earned by our military veterans will find themselves answering to the crown. We do not abandon those who served our nation with valor." CEO Margaret Stevens, who had been summoned to witness this unprecedented intervention, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I want to personally apologize for this incident and assure you that Captain Mitchell will be treated with the utmost respect going forward." "See that he is," King Charles replied. "And see that this never happens again to any veteran in your employ." The king then turned back to James, his expression softening. "Captain Mitchell, would you please put on your Victoria Cross? I believe it's time for you to wear it again." With trembling hands, James reached into his pocket and withdrew the bronze medal. As he pinned it to his uniform, he felt not just the familiar weight of the medal, but the restoration of his dignity and the validation of his service. "There," King Charles said with satisfaction. "That's exactly where it belongs." The moment was captured by an official photographer who had accompanied the royal party, creating an image that would soon become iconic. A decorated veteran being personally honored by his king, while the person who had humiliated him looked on in shame. The aftermath of King Charles's intervention transformed everything at Heathrow Airport and beyond. Within hours, the story of the monarch personally defending a Victoria Cross recipient had spread across every major news outlet in the world. The image of James Mitchell pinning his medal back onto his uniform while the king looked on approvingly became one of the most shared photographs of the year. Sarah Henderson's career at British Airways ended that same afternoon. CEO Margaret Stevens made it clear that someone who could create such a catastrophic public relations disaster while displaying such profound ignorance of British military traditions had no future with the company. Sarah's termination was swift and decisive, accompanied by a strongly worded statement about the airline's commitment to honoring veterans. The financial impact on British Airways was immediate and severe, but in an unexpected direction. While the initial controversy had damaged the company's reputation, the king's intervention and their quick response to correct the situation actually boosted public perception. Bookings from military families and veteran organizations increased dramatically. The airline found itself positioned as a company that, despite making a serious error, had the integrity to make things right when confronted with the truth. James Mitchell became an overnight celebrity, though he struggled with the attention. News programs wanted interviews, military organizations invited him to speak at events, and social media was filled with messages of support from around the world. The quiet dignity with which he handled both the original humiliation and the subsequent vindication impressed everyone who met him. 3 weeks after the incident, James was surprised to receive an official invitation to Buckingham Palace. King Charles had requested a private audience to discuss the broader issues raised by what had happened at the airport. The meeting took place in the king's private study, a room lined with military histories and photographs of the royal family with various service members. "Captain Mitchell," the king began as they sat in comfortable leather chairs, "I wanted to speak with you about something important. Your situation highlighted a troubling trend in how our society sometimes treats its veterans. Too often, the people who serve our country with honor find themselves marginalized or forgotten when they return to civilian life." James nodded thoughtfully. "Your Majesty, I've been fortunate in many ways. Many veterans face much greater challenges than having someone question their right to wear a medal." "Precisely why I wanted to discuss this with you," King Charles replied. "I'm establishing a new initiative to ensure that military honors and veteran achievements are properly recognized and protected in civilian workplaces. Would you consider helping to lead this effort?" The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. James had spent his entire adult life in service, first to the military and then to his airline passengers. The idea of serving his country again, this time by helping other veterans, appealed to something deep in his character. "I would be honored, Your Majesty," James replied. "If my experience can prevent other veterans from facing similar treatment, then something good will have come from all this." The royal initiative, announced several months later, established clear protections for military decorations in civilian workplaces and created support networks for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. James became one of its most effective advocates, traveling throughout the United Kingdom to speak with employers, veterans organizations, and government officials about the importance of honoring military service. British Airways underwent significant changes as well. The company, implemented comprehensive training programs about military service and veteran issues for all management personnel. They established a veterans liaison position and created clear policies protecting the rights of military personnel to wear their decorations with pride. The airline also began actively recruiting veterans, recognizing the leadership skills and work ethic they brought to civilian careers. Emma Watson was promoted to a supervisory position, partly in recognition of her loyalty to James during the crisis. She often told the story of the day the king came to Heathrow to defend a war hero, and how it restored her faith in the idea that doing the right thing still mattered in the modern world. Captain Roberts and other veteran employees at the airport formed an informal support network that helped military personnel transitioning to civilian careers. They shared James's story as an example of how one person's courage, both in combat and in standing up for principle, could inspire positive change throughout an entire organization. The Victoria Cross that had caused so much controversy became a symbol of something larger than military valor. It represented the ongoing connection between those who serve and the society they protect, and the responsibility of civilian institutions to honor that service appropriately. James continued, working for British Airways for 2 more years before retiring to focus full-time on veteran advocacy. His final flight was attended by hundreds of colleagues, passengers, and military personnel who wanted to honor a man who had served his country with distinction in both war and peace. On his last day, as James walked through Heathrow Airport, wearing his uniform with the Victoria Cross prominently displayed, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning when Sarah Henderson had ordered him to remove his medal. The airport that had once been the site of his humiliation had become a place where military service was celebrated and respected. The incident had taught him that standing up for principle, even when it seemed hopeless, could lead to changes far beyond what any individual might imagine. His refusal to accept that his medal was merely a personal decoration had sparked a national conversation about how society treats its veterans and ultimately led to better protection for military honors throughout the United Kingdom. Years later, when asked about the day the king came to defend his honor, James would smile and say that it proved something he had always believed, that service to others, whether in combat or in daily life, creates bonds that transcend rank, class, and circumstance. The Victoria Cross on his chest wasn't just his medal. It belonged to every person who had ever put duty before self-interest, and it was worth defending not for personal pride, but for the values it represented. The legacy of that extraordinary day at Heathrow Airport lived on in improved treatment for veterans, better understanding of military service among civilian employers, and the knowledge that sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, the most powerful people in the world will stand with you.